If you know anything about the history of abandoned Disney attractions, you will have no doubt heard of places like Discovery Island or River Country or the Wonders of Life Pavilion. But after the urban exploring craze of the 2010s died out, most of these places have since been demolished, cleaned up, or heavily blocked off, out of view from the public. But there is one abandoned part of Disney World history that still sits in plain view of guests. A short-lived boat ride, once operating at Animal Kingdom, now rotting away on the shores of the Discovery River. And to me, one of the most fascinating, lesser-known parts of defunct Disney history. So let's take a look at the creation, the decline, and the eventual abandonment of one of Animal Kingdom's worst rides, the Discovery Riverboats. Disney's Animal Kingdom theme park opened to the public on April 22, 1998, the resort's fourth and final theme park to date. Animal Kingdom was an incredibly ambitious project themed around conservation and the world of animals, featuring an intricately detailed hand-carved tree as a centerpiece, an animal habitat larger than Magic Kingdom, and several brand new attractions themed for both modern day and prehistoric animals. But Animal Kingdom was missing something. The original plans for the park also featured another area themed around the world of mythical animals named Beastly Kingdom. Beastly Kingdom would be a larger-than-life fairy tale world divided into two halves, for good and evil animals. In the good side, there will be two main attractions. First, the Fantasia Gardens boat ride, a slow-moving journey through scenes inspired by the movie Fantasia. And the second would be a walkthrough attraction named The Quest for the Unicorn, a hedge maze where guests would have to find several idols that would eventually lead them to a hidden grotto and an encounter with an animatronic unicorn. Somewhat similar in style to the walkthrough attractions of Disneyland Paris. And the evil side of the land would feature the Dragon's Tower, planned to be Animal Kingdom's signature e-ticket ride, a high-speed roller coaster through a burnt-out castle where guests would attempt to steal treasure protected by a fire-breathing animatronic dragon, one of the largest animatronics in Disney history. The land was expected to be a major draw of Disney's new park, boasting some of the best theming and biggest thrills, away from the calmer, quieter areas where the real animals would be. But on opening day, Beastly Kingdom was nowhere to be seen. Unfortunately, the land was met with something far more deadly than a fire-breathing dragon: budget cuts. Beastly Kingdom was featured heavily in promotion for Animal Kingdom during the park's construction phase. It would be referenced by Disney in marketing campaigns, and the official souvenir book for Disney World's 25th anniversary featured concept art and a description of the land. But by the time it came to actually build Beastly Kingdom, Animal Kingdom's construction had already cost $800 million. And Disney was still suffering from the financial burden of the poor opening of Euro Disneyland in Paris at the beginning of the decade, something that would continue to have a knock-on effect on all of their projects well into the early 2000s. Animal Kingdom was always supposed to be split into three parts: real animals, prehistoric animals, and mythical animals. Real live animals had been the priority for the park, so most construction had focused on that. But with opening day inching ever closer, Disney simply couldn't afford to have both the prehistoric and mythical areas, and so ultimately, then Disney CEO Michael Eisner chose prehistoric, with construction beginning on Dinoland USA. However, Beastly Kingdom wasn't cancelled. Instead, the project was simply delayed until after the Phase 1 stage of the park was complete. In its place in the southwestern edge of the park, Disney would build Camp Mini Mickey, a temporary, much cheaper land themed to the American woodlands of the Northeast, hosting character meet and greets, a Pocahontas live show, and the Festival of the Lion King stage show. Disney continued to assure guests that a mythical animal area would be coming at some point in the future, as the park's first expansion. Several hints at what was to come were scattered throughout the park, and one mythical themed ride was to open with the park, a boat ride to introduce guests to the land, named the Discovery Riverboats. Amid the delays of Beastly Kingdom, the Discovery Riverboats were a new idea intended to add more to do at Phase 1, and importantly, provide guests with a preview of the upcoming land. The ride would be a tour through the park, taking a lap of the Discovery River, the moat surrounding Animal Kingdom's central safari village, which is the land that housed the Tree of Life. The tour would take guests past each of the different lands of the park, where their guide would point out various animatronic and special effects scenes, in a similar style to the ride Jungle Cruise at Magic Kingdom and Disneyland. But the ride would also serve a dual purpose as transportation around the park, kind of like the Magic Kingdom Railroad. While going through Africa, hot spring geysers would go off all around, and while passing through Dinoland USA, guests would come face to face with an animatronic dinosaur wading through the shallow water. But of course, the big draw of the attraction would be when the boat passed through the future site of Beastly Kingdom. As guests entered the area, they would come across a mysterious cave entrance, where inside a large animatronic dragon would be lurking, very similar to the one that already existed underneath Sleeping Beauty Castle in Disneyland Paris. Except this time, as you passed the cave, the dragon would suddenly emerge, attempting to attack the boat, breathing fire towards guests. The skipper would steer the boat out of danger, but would nervously warn guests that the dragon may have awoken another monster, the Kraken, who's rumoured to lurk in the waters beneath them. As they progressed on their journey, the boat would begin to rock, the water bubble, and eventually the fins of the Kraken would surface, attempting to encircle the boat. Likely a very similar effect to that which Universal had used several years earlier with their Jaws attraction. But unlike Universal, instead of pulling out a grenade launcher, because this is Disney after all, the skipper would pull out a lyre and play a song that would calm the Kraken, who would then sink back into the water for the next group of guests. As you make your escape, the skipper would then suddenly point out a unicorn hidden in the forests on the shoreline. The unicorn would only appear briefly, rearing up and then disappear off into the forest, as the boat pulls into the dock to end the tour. The attraction would have been full of unique special effects and animatronics, and a great stopgap between the park's opening and the opening of the delayed land. But unfortunately for the Discovery riverboats, the ride guests actually got was not quite so spectacular. Much like Beastly Kingdom itself, the original version of the Discovery riverboats was heavily affected by budget cuts. In the rush to get the attraction ready for the April 1998 opening, nearly every single effect of the ride was cut back, and some, like the Kraken, were removed entirely. In fact, the Kraken was removed so late into the ride's development that one of the boats eventually used on the real thing still had cutouts in its hull for where the rumbling effect would be generated. In March of that year, the first guests attended cast member and pass holder previews of Disney's Animal Kingdom Park, getting to visit the Tree of Life, Kilimanjaro Safaris, Countdown to Extinction, and the many other sites that would feature on opening day. And finally, members of the public were able to take a trip on the now severely reduced version of the Discovery riverboats. Instead of doing a complete lap of the Discovery River, the attraction would be split into two halves. Boats would load up with guests at one of two docks on either side of the park, travel halfway along their route, then drop those guests off at the second dock, where a new load of guests would be picked up and taken on the second half of the trip. This was unusual compared to most transportation rides at Disney, which might have stops, but would typically allow you to stay on for the whole route. Presumably, the slow-moving riverboats caused a capacity problem that forced Disney to split the ride in two. On park maps, guests were warned that this was a one-way trip. If you wanted to experience the full ride, you'd have to queue for it twice. The first dock was located near the entrance to Safari Village. Embarking from here, guests would have their journey narrated by the boat's skipper, who would give an overview of the various areas of the park they could visit later in their day when they went past them. The narration also contained plenty of puns in the style of the Jungle Cruise to try and make the tour slightly more interesting. The tour would start straight away in the mythical area, where guests would spot the unicorn in the distance just like originally planned, albeit in a slightly different location. But rather than being any sort of animatronic, the unicorn would just be a static figure in the distance, with mist and lighting effects used, intending to give it the illusion of movement. Passing under the bridge to Camp Mini Mickey, guests would see engravings on the walls underneath, and a small stone shack. potentially the leftover remnants of an original Trolls Bridge scene for the ride that was scrapped before opening. But I can honestly find very little information about what exactly that would have been. On the other side of the bridge, a rock formation shaped like a dragon could be seen in the distance, a sign they were entering the dragon's territory. And to their left, they would spot the most significant part of the ride that had survived the extensive cuts. The cave to their left, surrounded by large rock needles rising out of the water, and strewn around the entrance to the cave were the bodies of medieval knights in various states of disarray and dismemberment. Some half melted, some in pieces, and some impaled on spikes. Probably the most gruesome sight at Walt Disney World. And as they passed the cave, the dragon would attack. But it wouldn't emerge from the cave like in the concept art, as the dragon animatronic had been cut too. Instead, a simple fire effect would emerge from the cave, as if the dragon was deep within it, sending a warning to guests. Leaving the preview area for Beastly Kingdom, the boat would then round the corner to enter Africa, where on their right they would see the ride's hot spring geysers. Jets of water shot up into the air, accompanied by a steam effect. The skipper would then introduce them to the backstory of the port town of Harambe, the fictional area where Animal Kingdom's Africa was set, and they'd see more assorted theming lining the harbour walls, boats, fishing equipment, and old cannons from the town's colonial days. Then the boat would pass under another bridge, and it would pull into the dock in Asia to end the first half of the tour. The second group of guests would be taken through Asia, a land that, at the time, was still under heavy construction, as the skipper would tell them about what attractions they could expect to see over the coming year. In the distance, they could see several abstract water sculptures of different animals, and upon entering the Dinoland USA section of the ride, guests would finally get to see the Discovery Riverboat's only animatronic, a full-size Aladar animatronic, the main character from the 2000 Disney computer animated movie Dinosaur. Aladar stood in the shallow part of the water, staring at guests as their boat went past, and pulled into the Safari Village dock to end the ride.
What is that?
It's the Iguanodon. One of the researchers from the Institute built a time machine and rescued him. He's a big guy with a big appetite, but don't worry, he's strictly vegetarian. Unless you're insectivorous over there.
And that was it. A fire effect, a few water effects, and one animatronic. The real-life version of the Discovery Riverboats was incredibly lackluster compared to what had initially been planned. Every scene was a much cheaper, much more basic version, and there were just too few of them considering the full loop of the ride was 20 minutes long. Most of the ride was spent travelling very slowly down a river, as a cast member told you facts about all of the areas of Animal Kingdom you could have been exploring were you not stuck on the boat.
At Camp Mini Mickey, they have Grandmother's Willow's Grove, and they offer a show there that will introduce you to North American woodland creatures such as rabbits, raccoons, and even skunks.
And most of the actual scenes were not even particularly exciting. The geysers were simply a water effect, the water sculptures were weird and super far away, half of the riverbanks were still under construction, you're cool. And the mythical areas, the main part of the ride, was the most disappointing of all. The unicorn being reduced to just a basic statue was disappointing enough, but the lighting effects barely ever worked as intended, only ever being fully operational during some of the previews, and so they were very quickly switched off, with the unicorn being aged to look more like a stone statue than a living animal. This unicorn's quite interesting because barely any photos even exist of it, and none show it in its fully functional state. To the point where for many years, a lot of Disney fans didn't believe that it ever existed in the first place. To date, the only known evidence of the unicorn actually working is a single home video of cast member previews where you can see it for just a few frames. And I just find that really interesting that, much like a unicorn is supposed to be, Animal Kingdom's unicorn was an incredibly rare sight. And the Dragon Cave, probably the only part of the ride where anything actually happened, came with its own problems too. During previews, many guests complained about the sight of the knights outside the cave, saying it was too dark and violent of a scene for Disney World. And so before the park even officially opened, this too was removed, with the cave just featuring the dragon's fire effect. And if that didn't make things difficult enough, sometimes the fire effect wouldn't work either. When Animal Kingdom did finally open at the end of April 1998, the Discovery Riverboats ride was even more cut back than the already cut back version that had been previewed. In response to this, Disney added live animal handlers to the boat, who would display animals like snakes and scorpions to guests during the journey. But this did very little to distract guests from the complete emptiness of the attraction, and so complaints very quickly mounted. Not only was the ride too slow, but with the Florida heat, it was also very uncomfortable. Nobody wanted to go on a cruise along a swampy river with nothing to see. The ride's capacity also proved to be very limited, and so lines would actually become far longer than anticipated, which would inevitably lead to guests being even more disappointed when they finally boarded the ride, discovered what they were in store for, and then couldn't leave. The animal handlers were removed quite early into the ride's lifespan, and by the end of the year, Disney renamed the ride to the Discovery River Water Taxis to try and emphasize the transportation element, and essentially suggest to guests that they shouldn't expect anything significant. And in 1999, a further update was made to attempt to salvage the ride, renaming it once again to the Radio Disney River Cruise. The ride's scenes would remain the same, but the animal handlers would be removed, and instead of the boat's skipper giving narration, a pre-recorded radio show from Radio Disney would play over the boat's speakers. Now aimed at kids, the Radio Disney hosts, Just Plain Mark and Zippy, would broadcast from the very top of the Tree of Life for their special Animal Kingdom radio show, where they'd play several animal-themed songs like Eye of the Tiger and songs from The Lion King, as well as take calls from listeners like Minnie Mouse, and tell plenty of animal-themed jokes.
Why don't elephants ride bicycles? Because they have to ring the bell with.
Apparently this was supposed to be an improvement on the original version, and maybe young kids did like it, but to me, this seems like the absolute worst version of the ride. But the Radio Disney retheme didn't seem to do anything to help the Discovery Riverboats, because on August 21st, 1999, not even 2 years into operation, the ride was permanently closed. But that wouldn't be the end for the Discovery Riverboats. Not exactly. After the closure, the docks sat blocked off and unused, but the covered queue areas were repurposed for character meet and greets. The Aladar animatronic was removed from the water, stripped to its skeleton and moved to Paris, where it was to be displayed as a fake movie prop on the backlot tour at Walt Disney Studios. And the water sculptures remained in the park until the year 2000, when they were eventually removed. The boats themselves were put into storage, only brought out for occasional special events, and eventually some were repurposed at Epcot. But for most of the scenes along the riverbanks, in classic Disney World fashion, they were just left there. Still visible from some points in the park, sort of excusable as just general park theming, but in reality, the remains of the Discovery Riverboats had been abandoned. As Animal Kingdom entered the early 2000s, it still hadn't opened Beastly Kingdom. In 1999, Disney's main competition Universal had opened their second theme park in Florida, Islands of Adventure, which featured a land named the Lost Continent, an area containing mythical creatures, including its own dragon roller coaster, and a place alleged to have been borrowed from Disney by Imagineers who left the company. But after Islands of Adventure failed to achieve the initial success Universal had hoped for, Michael Eisner quietly cancelled the Beastly Kingdom project, extending the lifespan of the temporary Camp Mini Mickey and making a further blow to the promise of mythical animals at Animal Kingdom. By 2003, the aging remnants of the Discovery Riverboats were the only substantial mythical elements to have ever existed in the park, now only visible from a distance, with most guests not even noticing them or questioning what they were. And as they rotted away, the thick foliage of Animal Kingdom's shorelines slowly engulfed them over time. I haven't been able to find a source for exactly when, but at some point in time during the ride's operation, the unicorn statue was moved backstage, leaving behind the plinth it once stood on. The unicorn itself then sat backstage behind Camp Mini Mickey for years, left to decay, out of sight of guests. The African geyser scene was left on the riverbanks, and the park's foliage was allowed to envelop it, as its colours began to fade and the rockwork became covered in moss. Many of the elements of the Africa area of the ride were also just left where they were, as they became not a part of the Discovery riverboats, but just a general part of Africa's theming. The Dragon Rock remained at the entrance to Camp Mini Mickey, with its water feature still running, but now becoming increasingly overgrown. And the Dragon's Cave was left exactly as it was, partway along the river, far from guests who could no longer get close to it, as it decayed over the years. In 2006, Disney opened Expedition Everest in the Asia section of the park, finally bringing mythical creatures to Animal Kingdom in a slightly different way than originally planned. In 2011, Disney announced Pandora: The World of Avatar, a major expansion to Animal Kingdom based on the Avatar movies, replacing Camp Mini Mickey, after its temporary life in the park of 13 years. The Festival of the Lion King Theatre would be moved to an expanded area at the park's Africa, and the land would be cleared for construction. In the initial clearing of the backstage area, the unicorn statue was dug up once again, and instead of just throwing it out, Disney decided to put it up for auction among cast members. The unicorn was purchased by a cast member who knew its history, and today you can still keep up to date with it on its own Instagram page, Beastly the Unicorn. The owner even dresses him up for special occasions. After some delays to construction, Pandora finally opened to the public in 2017, 5 years ahead of Avatar 2. And around the same time, the two docks were finally demolished, with some small remnants remaining in the water to this day. In Paris, the Aladar animatronic remained on the studio tour, but after years of neglect, it had unfortunately rotted so badly that Disney had to scrap it. Today, nearly 25 years on from the closure of Disney's short-lived Discovery riverboats, the river is still used by characters that float down on barges accompanied by live bands, but guests are no longer able to take trips down the river. But to this day, Disney still hasn't cleaned up much of the ride, and there are still many remnants of the Discovery riverboats if you know where to look. The queue areas still continue to be used for character meet and greets and stroller parking. The hot springs in Africa are still visible from outside of the Festival of the Lion King Theatre. With the opening of Pandora, Disney added a wooden walkway by the river shore to allow for a quick route to Africa. Using this, guests can now get right up close to the Dragon Cave as it sits dormant in the water. According to fan website Parkeology, the plinth that held the unicorn can still just about be made out beneath the overgrowth. And lastly, the Dragon Rock can still be seen along the riverbanks, now with its water feature no longer working. A reminder of Disney's abandoned boat ride and the beastly kingdom that never was. The Discovery riverboats met a sad end, but the ride was never very good to begin with, and it only really served to show what could have been with the Beastly Kingdom expansion had Disney been able to afford to make it. I never rode the Discovery riverboats, but even if I was able to, I don't think I would have bothered. It was only supposed to be something temporary before the land was opened, but even so, it just seemed so boring. Like everything about it was an afterthought. But despite how lackluster it might have been, to me, this ride is such a fascinating part of defunct Disney history. A glimpse at a completely different direction that Animal Kingdom could have gone in. And I also find it super interesting in its status as one of Disney's abandoned attractions because of how obscure it is. Places like River Country and Discovery Island are talked about all the time in fan circles, but here we have another abandoned ride that still sits in plain sight inside one of the parks, that never gets anywhere near as much attention. Did you ever ride the boats yourself? What do you think Disney should do with the remnants left in Animal Kingdom? Let me know in the comments. Other than that, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing, as I'm always working on more theme park videos coming in the future. And as always, I'll see you next time.